This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, here's something I didn't know before reading the story from our next guests, Sarah Holder and Fola Akinnibi. They're CityLab reporters here at Bloomberg News. America's pretrial detention system is actually a global outlier. It's set apart by an emphasis on cash bail and the for-profit infrastructure that supports it. So if you can't afford your bail, a company in the $2 billion commercial bail bond industry will cover it for a fee. And if you don't qualify for bail bonds or can't afford them, you go to jail. You wait months or even years for a trial. Fola and Sarah writing about the success and challenges of New York City's supervised release program in the current issue of Bloomberg Businessweek. It's the annual City's double issue. It's on newsstands now. It's online at bloomberg.com/businessweek, and it's on the Bloomberg terminal. Fola's here in the studio. Sarah's on Zoom in New York. Also here, the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, Joel Weber, in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Joel, good to have you with us. The supervised release program here in New York City, I can't really call it experimental anymore.
I didn't know about it, though. Did you know about it?
I had heard of it.
Okay.
In terms of, when we voted for it.
Yeah.
Or voted against it, depending on how people voted. But I didn't know about the successes and failures of it.
So one of the things, as we were kind of putting together the cities issue, we really wanted to take like this look at where cities are 3+ years after the pandemic. And this idea from Fola and Sarah, I thought was a really interesting way to talk about criminal justice and this experiment that's happened in New York that I think has been worthy of more national attention than it's perhaps received. And as you mentioned, U.S. huge outlier in terms of incarceration numbers. What the program has shown is this interesting success already. And part of this is the burden that is put on people who are innocent until proven guilty, but they cannot be on the street unless they have money for bail. And this has really challenged that assumption. And Fola, talk to us about who are the instrumental people who are helping make this pilot a thing.
Thanks, Joel. And so I guess, first of all, the jail system in the U.S., folks have been, it's greatly expanded since the 70s. And so there are 4 times as many people behind bars pre-trial in the
Four
US.
times?
Yeah, 4 times.
And pre-trial?
Yeah, pre-trial. Accused but not convicted of any crime than there were in the 70s. And so these systems have sprung up in jurisdictions across the U.S., New York having one of the most expansive ones to address this ballooning population of folks that are being held before they've been convicted. And so here in New York, we have this supervised release program, and so each borough has a provider. Well, Brooklyn and Staten Island share a provider, but basically the intent is to divert people from jail and keep them from having to pay bail that in many cases they can't afford. And instead give them programming, give them, job interview help, give them access to housing, give them access to food, and give them access to things that they need to ensure that they don't end up back in front of a judge or back, in the criminal legal system. And so that's sort of what this program sprung up out of, and it's what it's meant to address, to keep people out of jail. I'd note that 27 people have died at Rikers since the beginning of 2022, and
just so our listeners and viewers know, Rikers here in New York is a place where people are held, a pre-trial place.
Yes. It's
so that's people who are awaiting trial.
People who are awaiting trial. Yeah. Most of them. I think like 90% of the folks there.
I want to bring Sarah into this conversation to get your insight on also the politics when it comes to letting people walk free. Walk us through as far as what the issues are there and the politics behind that.
Yeah, I mean, bail reform as a policy change has, attracted a lot of attention nationwide. It's kind of the new boogeyman after the defund the police movement. People were talking about sort of diverting funds from police departments and reforming the practices of police. Now we're talking more broadly about the criminal legal system that Fola laid out for us, trying to think about new ways to hold people responsible for crimes, but also sort of understand that the current system as it is right now lets people who have the means walk free, while others who do not have the means, who are just as innocent before proven guilty, have to go to places like Rikers. So bail reform as a national movement has been tried in places across the U.S. Illinois, Washington, D.C., and New York City are trying to look at different ways to allow people to await trial outside of jails like Rikers. But obviously politicians that engage and try to exert these policy changes face a lot of political attacks. It's a hot button issue across the left and the right. And so programs like this are kind of trying to actually set up the infrastructure in place for cities that take on this politically fraught challenge of bail reform. Like what do people who are no longer eligible for bail, what do they do? And so supervised release is sort of like a programming change that attacks this or addresses this more charged political issue. And Fola can talk a little bit more about what politicians face when they do take on bail reform.
Well, before we let him do that, let's talk about what this looks like in practice. And there's a character in the story, Kevin, which is a pseudonym. But let's talk about what Kevin faced and how the program affected him personally.
Yeah, so at a basic level, when you're arrested in New York City, you're processed, you're booked, and then eventually, usually after 24 hours or so, you're in front of a judge. And in reporting out the story, Sarah and I spent a lot of time in court watching these arraignments, watching this happen, right? And these hearings take you wouldn't guess 5 minutes, no matter what the charges are. And so at that point, a judge is going to decide, well, are you going to get bail, or are they going to release you and say, come back to your court date, or are they going to give you supervised release? And so once you're diverted to a program like this, someone like Kevin is being connected with a social worker immediately. And they'll have to meet, depending on the severity of the charges, they'll have to meet a certain number of times a month. For him, it's 4 times a month. And essentially, it looks like a therapy session. He talks to his caseworker about issues he's facing and what he's trying to do. He's looking for a job maybe, or he's looking for help finding housing, and they hook him up with services. And so in his life, it's helped him. It's helped connect him with services, helped get him a job, and helped make him helped him navigate the system that can be so complicated.
Even, one of the most interesting things I thought was reminded of is the economic toll that being in jail and not being able to afford bail actually is. Talk about what Kevin faced on that front.
So when he was standing in front of the judge, waiting to hear what his fate would be, city prosecutors had asked for $1 million bail, and that's something he could never afford or could never pay. And so this program allowed for another way, right? Sort of a middle way, right? They don't have to let him go walk free, or they're not letting him walk free, but they're also not going to make him go to Rikers, right? And so he's able to do this programming. He's able to still go home, but he has this responsibility to come and participate in supervised release. And he's been going, weekly for 6 months as his case winds through the system. That's 6 months he would have spent in Rikers.
It's incredible, that story, Fola, on its own. But Sarah, I want to bring you back in here and talk about how the city and advocates for this measure success on the larger term. How do we know if it's successful here in New York City?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And I think caseworkers are grappling with that as well. Like, one of the biggest takeaways, when we were at arraignments court, was that people were not getting sent to Rikers and they were getting sent to supervised release. And I think for caseworkers, that's a measure of success. Are you diverting one more person away from that notorious jail? And we saw, as sometimes prosecutors would ask for $1 million bail, or we saw even $15,000 bail, something that defendants just could not pay. And we saw judges and public defenders and even prosecutors in some instances say, why don't we do supervised release instead? This person is not a flight risk. They will return to court. So we saw in real time people getting diverted from from Rikers. So that's one measure of success. Another is how many times people are showing up for court again. In places like DC, we've seen, people released pretrial come back to court, more than 80% of the time. And that's really what bail is supposed to do. It's supposed to ensure that people, face their day in court and don't disappear. Supervised release is another way of making sure that people do that they show back up. And then another way of thinking about this is whether people are getting rearrested while they're awaiting their day in court. People out on supervised release in the city get rearrested less than 10% of the time, less than 2% of the time for a violent felony. And, people are looking at those numbers and trying to understand how to get those even lower and how to work with some folks who are recommitting violent acts or even other offenses, and giving them a lot more attention within this program.
Hey, Fola, something I'm curious about is how does the approach when it comes to the U.S. differ than what typically is seen more internationally?
So in other jurisdictions, cash bail is seen as a last resort. In the UK and Canada and in the EU, cash bail is sort of like the last resort, and bail bonds are illegal in most jurisdictions. I think it's just the U.S. and I believe the Philippines that allow.
So the U.S. being
bonds.
More of an outlier, clearly.
The U.S. is definitely an outlier.
But New York is also not totally an outlier, right? Mm-hmm. Like there is, it's not like I want to get into politics of this still, but like who else is following New York's lead here, and where else should we be watching to see what how those programs unfold?
So there are quite a few jurisdictions, or I guess not quite a few, but there are some jurisdictions that are trying to address the same issue, right? Trying to reduce jail populations, because we have to remember that jailing people is expensive, like for a jurisdiction, for a municipality.
What's the cost in New York?
In New York, it's like $1,500 a day, I think, per person. And so, wow. It's pricey. Yeah. It's like I think it's like sort of like a college tuition or something like that, right? Like you talk about annually, jailing people. And so there's an extreme cost for municipalities, and then on the other hand, there's an extreme cost for the folks who are going to jail, right? You're not working, you're not paying rent, you're not watching your kids, you're not doing all of these things that contribute to society as well. Right. And so there are those costs.
Okay, so I said we'd talk about the politics. Let's talk about the politics. What's the city line on this, and what about where the state comes in?
So this is it's a city-funded program, right? So the city spends about $67 million a year on this, and in the last budget cycle, we saw more money set aside for this program.
Is that a lot of money or not a lot of money?
It's more than pre-K.
Wow.
As we've reported before.
I will be off Thursday taking my son to his first day of pre-K. So,
there you
Fola, you did the great story on pre-K earlier this year about Eric Adams not providing funding to those pre-K centers.
And so I guess in the grand scheme of things, the New York City budget is $107 billion, so it's not that much money, but it is for a program like this quite a bit of it's quite an investment.
And just keep in mind also the economic side of this, right? Like instead of paying $1,500 per person per day, we're allowing those same people who might not be even violent offenders to basically like be able to keep their normal existence going, right? And be in their community. So I think it's really interesting. So what about how do other jurisdictions, how is this going over elsewhere, right? Because clearly we brought up the defend the police as a talking point. Like this is a charged idea because it goes against some conventional longstanding wisdom.
Definitely, and I think the New York City program sort of is a great example of the challenges that programs like these face, right? Like on one end, the program seems to be working, and it seems like it's getting support, right? And so it's ramped up, and so they have the caseworkers have a ton of cases, right? We met some people that have 70 cases on their plate. On the other hand, they have to worry about the politics of this, right? Like New York State has rolled back its bail reforms, I think 3 times at this point, right? In other jurisdictions, we've seen campaign ads sort of demonizing bail reform. Lee Zeldin last year ran ads saying that he would, reverse the bail laws. And so the politics of this are fraught, to say the least. And we see this in jurisdictions across the country.
Fola, a fantastic story, Sarah. a great story. Sarah Holder, CityLab reporter at Bloomberg News, on the phone from our bureau. Fola Akinnibi, CityLab reporter here at Bloomberg News, with us in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, along with Joel Weber, the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. This story and more in the Cities issue, the double issue of Businessweek.